All right, I reviewed my notes and I saw a couple small errors that I wanted to come back and fix. So if you would please go back in your notes and fix those. Yesterday, I'm on page 94, right, page 94. Yesterday, I was finding the answer to this question, the check your understanding number 2, k of x equals x plus 3, and m of x equals 3 minus x, and describing whether or not they were inverses. And so I noticed that when I was doing my work, 3 plus 3 is not 9. This should have been 6. Regardless, negative x plus 6, this should have equaled x if it were indeed that k of x and m of x were inverse functions. Okay, the second error that I found was on page 95. Page 95. Somehow I switched from a 3 to a 2, so I'm going to redo this example. Again, this is the try these C on page 95, and I'm doing example B. So example B, it says to find the inverse and state any restrictions on the domain of f and f inverse, or the domain and range, excuse me, of f and f inverse, so that they're both functions. All right, so to find the inverse, again, we rewrite this with a y, and then I'll switch x with y, and square root both sides to get rid of my square. Remember, we only take the positive case. So square root x equals y plus 3. And then I would subtract 3 from both sides. So y equals square root x minus 3. Again, you cannot subtract underneath a radical with a whole number or a rational number. So it just gets stuck at the end. Okay, now restrictions on the domain. So restrictions on the domain and range. So for the domain, what cannot happen is that this square root cannot be a negative number, right? Oh, let me rewrite that, I'm sorry. So the square root cannot equal a negative. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take what's under the radical, which is x, and I'm going to say that has to be greater than or equal to 0. If there was more under the radical, I'd have to solve this, but there is not. All right, so that's the restriction on the domain. And then the restriction on the range is that, again, y cannot be negative. So what I'll do, I need this to solve for this square root. So I'm going to, off to the side here, y equals square root x minus 3. I cannot have the square root equal to a negative. So I'm going to go ahead and solve for the square root. I get y plus 3 equals the square root of x. Now, what can't happen is y plus 3 cannot be, it must be larger than 0. And so I'll solve for y. And y must be larger than or equal to negative 3. So here's my domain. And here's my range. Remember, that's for the inverse function. So here's the domain and range of the inverse function. Therefore, the range and the domain of the original, so here's my f inverse function, my range and my domain will switch. So this will become my domain and this will become my range. So that would be x has to be greater than or equal to negative 3. And y has to be greater than or equal to 0. That's for f of x. And for f inverse of x, my domain is that x has to be greater than 0, greater than or equal to 0, and my range is that y has to be greater than or equal to negative 3. All right, because I messed that up, I'm going to do the try these that I said you guys should try. So I'm going to go ahead and do these two try these on page 96. So Because they take up quite a bit of room, I'm going to do them on a separate sheet of paper. Okay, so number 5 on page 96, the check your understanding. It says find the inverse of each function. Determine the domain and range of f of x so that both f and f inverse are functions. Okay, so number 5a, f of x equals negative 2x plus 5. So to find the inverse, recall that we will rewrite this using a y and then switch x with y. And then I'm going to solve for y. So I'll subtract 5 from both sides. X minus 5 equals negative 2y. I'll divide both sides by negative 2. So y equals x minus 5 over negative 2. And then I'll rewrite it with my proper function notation, which is f inverse of x equals x minus 5 all over negative 2. Recall that we don't really usually keep the negative down in the denominator. So f inverse of x equals, we'll put the negative out front, negative x minus 5 all over 2. Okay, so there is my inverse function. It does say to find restrictions on the domain. So restrictions on the domain and range for a linear function, which is, this is what this is. There's no squaring, there's no cubing, there's no square rooting. There's never going to be, I'll say that again, there is never going to be a restriction on the domain or the range of a linear function. Okay, there's never a restriction. So our domain and range for both, so the domain of f of x is all real numbers. So you can say all reals, or you can say from negative infinity to positive infinity, or you can use set notation. And the range, again, is all reals. You could say negative infinity to positive infinity, or if you wanted to, you could use set notation. All right, so that was 5a. Let's do 5b. 5b says f of x equals negative x plus 1 squared minus 4. Now, as soon as I see that we have a quadratic, I know that we're probably going to have restrictions. All right, so let's go ahead and find the inverse. So first I rewrite it with y, then I will switch x with y, and I'll begin to solve. To solve, I would want to add my 4 first. I get x plus 4 equals negative y plus 1 squared. I'd also want to get rid of this multiplication by negative 1. So to do that, I'll divide by negative 1 on both sides. And I get, when I divide this whole side or multiply this whole side by a negative, both signs will change. Whoops. This would be x minus 4, negative x minus 4, right? Both signs will switch, equals y plus 1 squared. And then I would square root both sides. Remember, when we take the square root, we're only going to take the positive root. So I get square root negative x minus 4 equals y plus 1. And then I will subtract 1 from both sides. And I end up with y equals the square root of negative x minus 4 minus 1. Remember, this minus 1 is never going to go underneath the radical. Okay, so now restrictions on the domain. First, let's check our restriction on x for the domain. So what I know is that under the radical, I cannot have a root. Under the radical cannot equal a negative. So I'm going to take whatever's under the radical, and I'm going to say it has to be greater than or equal to 0. And then I'll solve for x. So I would add 4, I get negative x must be greater than or equal to 4. And then I'll divide both sides by negative 1. And then don't forget that when you divide, this symbol is going to switch. When you divide or multiply by a negative, right? This sign will switch. So you get x, that becomes negative 4, and switch your inequality the other direction. So x has to be less than negative 4. All right, now for my range, this is my domain. My range, what I know is that my square root cannot equal a negative. So I'm going to isolate my square root. So y equals square root negative x minus 4 minus 1. First, isolate your radical by adding 1 to both sides. And now y plus 1 has to be greater than or equal to 0. So I'll subtract negative 1 from both sides. And that gives me that y has to be greater than or equal to negative 1. All right, now I'm going to go back to the original paper. So for the first one, I have that f inverse of x is equal to negative x minus 5 over 2. And the restrictions are the domain and range. So the domain, I'm going to come over here. So the domain was all real numbers, and the range was also all real numbers. Never a restriction on a linear function. All right, next we have a quadratic function. We found that the inverse function was f inverse of x equals the square root of negative x minus 4 minus 1. Please make sure that your radical does not go over that negative 1. And for the domain and the range, again, I'll come over here. All right, the domain and the range. So what we found was our domain here was that x had to be less than or equal to negative 4, which means that my range here will be this same value. So my range will be y is less than or equal to negative 4. And then I found that my range here was y has to be greater than or equal to negative 1. That means that my domain is x has to be greater than or equal to negative 1. All right, have a great weekend, and I hope that you're taking good notes. Please go back and fix any errors in your notes. Remember, your notes are for you to guide your homework, and if your notes are incorrect, then your homework will be incorrect. So make sure that you went back and made those corrections. Thank you. Have a great weekend.